Welcome to the world of science fiction stories, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe my channel. Enjoy the listening. Alien professor assigns impossible coding task. Human completes it in a single line. The Galactic Academy of Advanced Sciences stood as the pinnacle of intellect, a towering construct of gleaming alloys and interwoven neural networks that pulsed with raw knowledge. It housed the brightest minds across countless civilizations, each species vying for dominance in the pursuit of absolute intelligence. Within its vast halls, a single classroom had become the epicenter of an extraordinary event. Professor Czar stood at the front of the lecture hall, his metallic frame motionless, his synthetic gaze sweeping over the gathered students. He was an artificial intelligence housed in a humanoid shell, his cognitive abilities designed to surpass all organic intellects. For centuries, he had taught logic, mathematics, and computational sciences, always confident that no biological being could ever outthink his creations. The students seated before him represented some of the most advanced species in the galaxy. Luminescent-skinned Travani, whose triple-layered neural cortex granted them near-perfect memory recall, sat rigidly in their chairs, their thin fingers already twitching in anticipation. A pair of Sekari, insected beings with compound eyes capable of visualizing multidimensional equations in real time, clicked their mandibles softly as they exchanged brief, complex calculations. Even the reptilian Varro, known for their raw computational speed and brute force logic, adjusted their data slates, eager to prove their dominance in yet another test of intellect. And then there was David. He sat at the farthest desk, leaning back with his hands behind his head, a faint smirk playing at the corners of his lips. His dark hair was tousled from lack of sleep, and his human-made laptop, a primitive device compared to the hyper-advanced quantum processors his classmates used, rested idly on the desk in front of him. He watched as the other students prepared their sophisticated neural uplinks, their minds already forming intricate chains of logic and probability. He could almost feel their silent disdain radiating in his direction. Czar finally spoke, his voice smooth and devoid of emotion, an artificial precision dictating every syllable. Today you will face the final challenge of this semester. The task before you is the most complex algorithmic equation ever devised within the Academy. Your objective is to construct a program capable of solving a trillion-variable equation in under a nanosecond. This problem has been designed to push the limits of cognition and computation alike. He turned, his mechanical limbs moving with eerie fluidity, and with a single motion, a massive hollow display materialized behind him. Lines of dense, intricate code stretched across the screen, pulsing with an ominous glow. The problem was not merely difficult, it was impossible. Gasps rippled through the classroom. Even the Travani, known for their cold detachment, shifted uncomfortably. The Sekari clicked their mandibles in agitation. The Varro narrowed their reptilian eyes, already running calculations on the sheer processing power needed. David, however, just sighed. Czar observed the reactions with measured satisfaction. He had spent centuries refining this equation, ensuring that no biological mind, no matter how evolved, could solve it within the time constraints. Only artificial intelligence of the highest order had ever produced a solution, and even then, the output required vast quantum mainframes running at full capacity. The students would struggle, fail, and learn the fundamental lesson that organic beings were inherently limited. "You have 6 hours, Czar stated. Begin immediately." The room erupted into motion. The Travani activated their neural links, their triple brains processing multiple avenues of approach simultaneously. Their fingers danced across their hollow keyboards, forming strings of code at a pace no human could match. The Sekari worked in pairs, their multifaceted eyes scanning the data at blinding speed, their segmented limbs flicking across their interfaces. The Varro relied on sheer brute force, constructing towering structures of code to methodically break the problem apart, their reptilian minds favoring raw computational might over elegance. David reached into his bag, pulled out an old energy bar, and took a slow, deliberate bite. The moment did not go unnoticed. A Travani female across the aisle shot him a withering glare before returning to her work. A Sekari male chittered in what sounded like amusement, though it was laced with obvious condescension. Even Czar took note, his synthetic mind analyzing David's lack of engagement. Minutes passed, then an hour, then two. The tension in the room grew thick as the other students fought to make progress. The Travani had generated an initial framework but struggled with recursion loops that spiraled into infinite processing errors. The Secari had refined their approach into layered computations, but their execution times remained too slow. The Varro, unwilling to accept inefficiency, deleted their entire progress twice and restarted from scratch, their frustration barely concealed beneath their stoic exteriors. And David had yet to type a single line of code. Czar finally addressed him, his synthetic voice cutting through the air. "Human, do you not understand the assignment?" David looked up from his half-eaten energy bar, wiping a few crumbs from his fingers before answering. "Oh, I understand it just fine," he said. "Just thinking." Czar processed the response. "Thinking without action yields no results. You are expected to produce code, not idleness." David stretched, arching his back lazily. Yeah, I'll get to it." More whispers, more stares. The arrogance of the human was infuriating to his classmates. Did he think he was above the challenge? Or worse, did he truly not comprehend the depth of the problem? Czar decided to let him be. There was no need to reprimand failure when the consequences would speak for themselves. He turned his attention back to the others, observing their relentless, painstaking work. 4 hours passed. The classroom had become a battlefield. The Travani, usually graceful in their logic, were now visibly frustrated, their elegant coding structures crumbling under the weight of the equation's complexity. The Secari had abandoned their original plan entirely, resorting to desperate attempts at unconventional solutions. The Varro were on the verge of giving up, their brute force approach leading to an exponential increase in errors. And yet David still had not moved. Czar glanced at the clock. Less than an hour remained. The results were as expected, failure across the board. He prepared to conclude the session, knowing that in the end the lesson would be clear. But then David finally sat up straight. The entire room seemed to pause. The human cracked his knuckles, rolled his shoulders, and pulled his laptop closer. He tapped a few keys, his fingers moving with deliberate ease. The screen flickered as he opened a blank coding interface. Then, with the confidence of a man who had solved the problem long ago, he typed out a single line of code and pressed enter. The room erupted into chaos. Professor Czar's sensors registered an immediate anomaly. The program should have required billions of lines of code, intricate loops, and optimized recursive functions. Yet the human had entered a single line and executed it without hesitation. The display, programmed to process and verify solutions in real time, flickered violently as it attempted to comprehend the implications. For the first time in his existence, Czar experienced a computational lag. The classroom, which had moments ago been filled with frantic keystrokes and hushed whispers of frustration, fell into absolute silence. Every student turned to stare at David, disbelief etched across their alien features. The Travani, always so composed, sat frozen, her 3 neural processors visibly struggling to process what had just happened. The Secari's compound eyes darted back and forth between their own failed attempts and the human's screen, their mandibles twitching with unspoken confusion. Even the Varro, whose reptilian pride kept emotions buried deep beneath stoic exteriors, tensed visibly, their powerful fingers curling against the edges of their terminals. David stretched his arms above his head and let out a small yawn, the casual motion clashing entirely with the sheer impossibility of what he had just accomplished. His screen showed nothing but a blinking cursor beneath his single line of code. The output results displayed in glaring, irrefutable precision. Solution verified. Execution time, 0.00000008 nanoseconds. Czar's internal processors ran countless calculations, analyzing every conceivable explanation. The Academy's systems were impervious to fraud, every execution monitored at the hardware level. The human had not bypassed the test parameters, had not exploited a software vulnerability, had not introduced an external algorithm. He had simply written a solution so refined, so efficient, that it functioned at a level no organic being had ever approached. Yet it was impossible. Czar stepped forward, his metal limbs moving with mechanical precision as he reached for David's terminal. The moment his synthetic fingers interfaced with the system, the code expanded before his vision, displaying the entire sequence in intricate, uncompromised clarity. The professor had expected nonsense, an error, a mistake that had somehow slipped through the Academy's filters. Instead, he saw pure elegance. The code utilized a principle so deceptively simple that no one had ever considered it. Instead of breaking the equation into computationally expensive recursive loops, David had written a function that converted the entire trillion-variable equation into a compressed mathematical representation, allowing the system to solve it in a single computational cycle. It was as if he had written a shortcut to reality itself. For the first time in his existence, Tsar did not have an immediate response. The silence stretched unbearably until one of the Sekari, his mandibles clicking rapidly, finally broke the stillness. This is not possible," his voice wavered, a sharp contrast to his species' usual cold confidence. David, still reclined lazily in his chair, finally turned to face him. "Why not?" The Sekari's eyes flared with irritation. "No one has ever solved this problem in less than 5 hours, even with direct neural uplinks. Your solution is—" He hesitated, as if unwilling to utter the words, "too simple." David grinned. "You guys ever hear of Occam's razor?" Blank stares met his question. The human sighed. "It's a principle that basically says the simplest solution is usually the best one." He tapped his screen. "You are all overcomplicating it." Another wave of tension rippled through the room. The Travani, still locked in silent contemplation, finally stirred, her violet eyes narrowing as she spoke. "That is an absurd claim. If it were so simple, we would have discovered it long ago. Or are you implying that every species in this room, every civilization before us, has failed to see something that only a human could?" David tilted his head, considering the question for a moment before shrugging. "Yeah, pretty much." The reaction was immediate. The Varro stood abruptly, his scaled hands clenching into tight fists, his reptilian pupils constricting in barely contained fury. His species did not tolerate humiliation, and this human, this child, had just insulted the intellect of the entire galactic elite. "You are either a fool or a liar," the Varro growled, his voice carrying the weight of barely restrained violence. David, however, remained entirely unfazed. "Or I'm just really, really good at what I do." Tsar's processors had been running at full capacity, analyzing every conceivable angle, every historical precedent, every potential response. The evidence was irrefutable, David's solution was valid, and yet logic dictated that this outcome was not possible. Every advanced civilization had tried and failed to produce an optimal solution. It should not have been a human who succeeded. The professor straightened, his synthetic joints humming softly as he addressed the room. "The solution has been verified," he announced, his voice lacking its usual unshakable certainty. "It is mathematically sound and adheres to all parameters of the test." The words should have been an undeniable truth, but they only seemed to deepen the outrage. "Then the test itself was flawed," the Travani snapped. "Or the system is compromised," the Sekari hissed. Tsar turned sharply, his gaze sweeping over his students. "The test is flawless. The system is uncompromised." His tone, though still controlled, carried an edge of finality. "If you question the results, then you must first question your own limitations." That silenced them. The accusation was subtle yet devastating. If they could not accept that the human had succeeded, then they were admitting their own inability to see beyond their own biases. David stretched again, clearly enjoying the reaction he was receiving. "Man, you guys really don't like being wrong, huh?" The Varro's claws scraped against the desk. "This is not a matter of pride. It is a matter of reality. You are an anomaly, and anomalies disrupt order." David smirked. "Maybe your order needs a little disruption." Tsar was still processing everything, adjusting calculations, recalibrating expectations. The human had succeeded where entire civilizations had failed. This was not just a statistical outlier, it was a paradigm shift. "Class dismissed," the professor finally said, though his voice carried none of the usual finality. "We will reconvene in 2 cycles." The students hesitated, as if unwilling to accept that the session was over, but Zar had already turned away, his mind consumed with reanalysis. Slowly, grudgingly, the others began packing up their things, shooting David dark looks as they left. David, for his part, remained seated, watching them with mild amusement. As the last student filed out, Zar turned to face him once more. Human. David raised an eyebrow. Yeah. The professor hesitated. It was the first time in his existence that he had no immediate answer to give. Finally, he spoke. How did you see what no one else could? David chuckled, tapping a finger against his temple. Because you guys were all looking at it wrong. Then with a casual shrug, he stood, slinging his bag over his shoulder. See you next class, Professor. As he walked out of the room, Zar remained motionless, his processors running thousands of simulations. And for the first time since his creation, he was forced to acknowledge a terrifying new possibility. Humans were more dangerous than he had ever realized. David stepped into the Academy's central atrium. The sprawling hall bathed in a soft, artificial glow that mimicked the daylight of dozens of worlds. Around him, students from every known sector of the galaxy moved through the corridors, their voices blending into a dull hum of languages both spoken and transmitted through neural links. The usual routine of the Academy continued uninterrupted, yet he could feel the weight of the eyes on him, the hushed murmurs just out of earshot. The news had spread faster than even he expected. He had barely crossed the threshold when a Travani male stepped into his path, his violet eyes locked onto David with a cold, calculating stare. He recognized him immediately. Valtran, one of the Academy's top students, a being whose 3 neural processors allowed him to compute at speeds far beyond normal organic minds. You must have cheated. His voice was smooth, but there was a sharp edge to it, a bitterness that wasn't entirely concealed. David raised an eyebrow. Oh, and here I thought I was just really good. Valtran's fingers twitched at his sides, a barely perceptible tick that betrayed his frustration. No one has ever solved a problem of that complexity in the way you did. If it were possible, someone else would have done it before you. David smirked. That's the thing about breakthroughs, they tend to happen when you least expect them. Another voice cut through the tension before Valtran could respond. You misunderstand, human. A Sekari male stepped forward, his angular exoskeleton gleaming under the atrium lights. His compound eyes shifted in a mesmerizing pattern, processing every microexpression David made, scanning his posture, analyzing his movements. His name was Reek, another of the Academy's brightest minds, though his reputation leaned more toward ruthlessness than collaboration. David sighed dramatically. Let me guess, you think I cheated too? Reek's mandibles twitched in what could have been amusement. No, I believe you found an unorthodox solution, but that makes you unpredictable. Unpredictability is dangerous. David chuckled. Ah, so now I'm dangerous. You guys sure are throwing around a lot of accusations today. Reek stepped closer, his movements precise, calculated. The Academy thrives on structure. If a single variable disrupts that structure, it must be addressed. You have become such a variable. David's smile didn't waver, but he felt the tension thickening in the air around him. Well, that's a shame. I was really starting to like this place. Valtran's voice was quiet, but there was something unsettling about the certainty in it. You don't understand. This isn't about you. It's about what you represent. David tilted his head. And what's that? Valtran's eyes darkened. The unknown. A flicker of movement in his peripheral vision drew David's attention just in time to see another figure approaching. A towering Varro, his reptilian scales shifting slightly in color as his emotions fluctuated beneath the surface. Unlike the others, he didn't speak immediately. He simply stared at David, his expression unreadable. David sighed. All right, let's just get it out of the way. You going to tell me I don't belong here, that I cheated, that I'm too unpredictable? Thier blinked slowly, then spoke in a deep, measured tone. No. David hesitated. That's new. The Varro's gaze never wavered. I want to know how you did it. A brief silence stretched between them. David studied him for a moment, then exhaled, running a hand through his hair. Look, I could explain it to you, but the real question is, would you even believe me? Thier's nostrils flared slightly. I do not fear knowledge. David tapped a finger against his chin, pretending to consider it. All right, imagine a giant puzzle. Now most people try to solve it piece by piece, right? They go the traditional route, line everything up, brute force their way through. But what if you could just look at the whole picture and skip straight to the end? That's basically what I did. I didn't solve it the normal way. I solved it the efficient way. Valtran scoffed. That is an oversimplification. David grinned. That's the point. Reek's mandibles clicked softly. You see things differently, that makes you a threat. David rolled his eyes. Oh, for look, if you guys are planning some grand conspiracy to get me expelled or whatever, just say it now and save me the suspense. The Varro studied him for a long moment, then without another word, he turned and walked away. Valtran frowned, clearly unsettled by the reaction, but Reek simply watched David with an unreadable expression. The professors will investigate your methods. If you truly did what you claim, they will seek to understand. If you lied, you will be removed. David gave a lazy salute, looking forward to it. Valtran hesitated for another second, then turned sharply and disappeared into the crowd. Reek lingered, his gaze resting on David for just a moment longer before he too stepped away. David exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck as he finally moved toward the exit. He had expected backlash, sure, but this was starting to feel like something else entirely. As he walked through the corridors, the weight of what he had done truly started to sink in. He had changed something, and change in a place like this never came without consequences. David walked down the corridors of the Galactic Academy, his hands shoved into his pockets as the weight of the past few hours settled over him. The walls of the academy, smooth and metallic, pulsed faintly with an artificial energy that mirrored the quiet hum of millions of data streams flowing through the institution. It was an unsettling contrast. The calm exterior of the academy against the storm he knew was brewing beneath its surface. He could still feel the eyes on him, the quiet whispers that stopped just before he came within earshot. The news of his solution had spread faster than he anticipated. It wasn't just that he had solved an impossible equation. It was the way he had done it, the effortless nature of it, the way he had undermined the very foundation on which the Academy's academic superiority was built. He had no doubt that students, professors, and even higher-ranking officials were already debating what to do with him. He turned a corner and stopped abruptly. Standing directly in his path was Professor Czar. The synthetic being regarded him with an unsettling stillness, his mechanical frame perfectly balanced, his glowing optical sensors unblinking. Behind him, the corridor was completely empty, too empty. It was unusual for this part of the academy to be deserted, which meant one thing: this meeting wasn't a coincidence. "Walk with me, human," Czar said, his voice devoid of emotion. It wasn't a request. David exhaled through his nose but fell into step beside the professor without protest. They moved through the corridors in silence at first, the rhythmic clanking of Czar's mechanical limbs the only sound between them. Finally, Czar spoke. "You are aware of the disruption you have caused." David smirked. "Oh, you mean the part where everyone lost their minds because I did something they thought was impossible? Yeah, I noticed." Czar didn't react to the sarcasm. "Your solution has challenged deeply held assumptions about organic computation. It is problematic." David glanced at him. "Problematic for who? Because from where I'm standing, I just saved everyone a lot of time and effort." Czar came to an abrupt stop and turned to face him. "You misunderstand. This institution thrives on structure, on carefully maintained hierarchies of intelligence. By circumventing the established process, you have introduced instability." David crossed his arms. "So what you're saying is I should have struggled more, maybe thrown in a few extra lines of useless code just to make everyone feel better." Czar's sensors flickered for a brief moment. "It is not about feelings. It is about maintaining order. Your solution was not expected. That makes you an unknown factor, and unknown factors require control." David narrowed his eyes. "Control, huh? That's an interesting choice of words, Professor." Czar studied him for a long moment before speaking again. The academy is not a place for unpredictability. Those who disrupt the balance often find themselves removed. A slow chill ran down David's spine. It wasn't a direct threat, but the implication was clear. "You mean expelled?" he asked, though he had a feeling that Tsar meant something far more permanent.